Hello everyone, my name is Protesilaos, also known as Prot. Today I will continue reading from the book Tao Te Ching by the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Zi. Here is the book Tao Te Ching by Lao Zi. This is a translation by Professor Alan Du. What I have been doing in this series is to read through the pages of this book and provide commentary on them. My comments are not limited to the words that I am reading. Rather, I am broadening the perspective. I am commenting on the book by using examples or concepts that are not found in the book, yet I think are relevant to the book. My commentary is not supposed to be the canonical interpretation of Lao Zi's words. I am not interested in that kind of hermeneutics. I am not interested in pretending that I am some sort of oracle and I am here to spread the gospel of Lao Zi's teachings. I don't think that is a constructive approach when it comes to matters of philosophy. Philosophy is dialectical, it's a discussion. We want to think about it. We want to provide each other with food for thought, and we want to continue thinking. This is not a revelation. This is not a directive. This is not an exhortation that comes from some authority. These are the words of a wise person, but words which we need to still think through and not take at face value. Words which we still need to particularize and understand in the context of our actuality, understand in relation to other themes that are not mentioned in the book yet are relevant to the insights of the book. I am of the view that reading a book in a reverential way is counterproductive. Any book, more so a book by a philosopher. What we want to do is to read the book and think for ourselves. Use this as an impetus to think for ourselves and learn where we can learn and agree where we find points of agreement and disagree where we find points of disagreement. But always do it with an attitude of dialecticism, with an attitude of continuing with the dialogue. Let's think about it more. Let's think this through. Let's see where this will lead us. As such, you will find that much of my commentary is not focused on what Lao Zi is saying. I am not interested in going word by word, phrase by phrase, dissecting every little thing, trying to extract some hidden truth from individual words. Maybe there is value to that, but it is not what I am doing. I am interested in providing you with a bigger picture view of those matters, with an understanding that allows you to think of things holistically and not limited to an individual author. Let's continue with reading from the book with these in mind and see how it goes. This is chapter 3. Do not exalt the worthy, so that the people shall not contend. Do not value rare goods, so that the people shall not commit theft. Do not show desirables, so that the people's hearts shall not be disturbed. Therefore, the governance by sages is to simplify the people's minds, fill their stomachs, weaken their ambitions, and strengthen their bodies. They constantly keep the people free from cleverness and desires, and make the cunning ones not dare to make trouble. By governing without contrived actions, all will be well governed. And this concludes chapter 3. Overall, what we read in this chapter is a continuation of chapter 2, where Lao Zi provides a commentary on the notion of extremes and how we can think of the world in terms of pairs that cancel each other out or that make each other discernible, comprehensible, and in a sense valid. And in chapter 2, for example, we have binaries such as the idea of beauty is understood because of the idea of ugliness. Now I am paraphrasing, not reading directly. The idea of good is understood due to the idea of evil, and so on for the extremes. So overall, chapter 3 is telling us here that if we have a society that avoids the extremes, we will be able to have good governance. We will be able to live in a harmonious way, and this harmonious way will be a way of no conflicts. Intuitively, this makes a sense. So if we can have justice, what we would generalize as justice, if we can have that, then the society will be happy, will be peaceful, and so on. The problem here is twofold. The first is that we see governance by sages. Again, we encounter the concept of sages. This is the key word. It is the key word here just as it is the key word in chapter 2. Because Lao Zi is not talking about everybody. It is talking about people who have understood the insights of Tao and people who have thought things through very seriously for a very long time. These are not guidelines for the average fellow to just get access to those insights on a weekend and start living this way. That is not feasible. They don't have the requisite training, the requisite experience. So Lao Zi is talking about sages time and again. And this is important for us to bear in mind. And sages here are the ones who will be conducting governance. They are the ones who will engage in governance. And they are the ones who will bring about this harmonious society. This, of course, assumes that there will be sages around. A question for you to consider is, how many sages do you think exist nowadays, in our time? Can you list maybe 10, maybe 100 sages? I don't know. Maybe 1,000? I don't know. That's already stretching it, I think. I cannot even think of one. Or maybe I could think of one or two. But if we start increasing the number, then that gets very difficult. My point is that if you think that the world has, let's say, 100 sages on the planet right now, 100 people who are sages and who are alive, are those 100 people enough to govern, I don't know how many we are, 8 billion, something like that? Is this feasible? Do you think this will work? How will it work exactly? And what if we don't have that many sages? What if we have no sages whatsoever? What happens then? Who is supposed to govern? My point is that sage is such lofty of a standard that it is often an unrealistic target, as it is unrealistic in chapter 2, where it says, and I quote, "Therefore, sages manage affairs without contrived actions, teach without speech, allow all things to develop without forcing them to start, promote things without requiring gratitude, and accomplish things without claiming the credits. This sounds good. This all sounds good. But if you are not a sage, this makes no sense. How do you manage affairs without action? How do you teach without teaching? And then more importantly, how do you govern without action? How do you teach people who are not sages without speech? How do you legislate without promulgating some law? How do you instruct without providing instructions? How do you bring about harmony without bringing it into being, without creating it, without working in that direction? My point here is that we cannot avoid going into the details. And this is the second problem I have here with governance by sages. Not only sage is such lofty a target that it is unrealistic, but even if we have sages, it is not as simple as them thinking of analytical extremes and trying to find a balance between them. Analytical extremes such as the idea of beauty, which is juxtaposed to the idea of ugliness, and together they render each other meaningful, or the idea of good with the idea of bad. These are extremes. These are analytical extremes. Analytics is the process of abstracting away from the particularities and treating that pattern, that concept, as if it has a standalone presence. But analytics do not exist as such. They have to be couched again in terms of the cosmic continuum from which they were extracted, they were abstracted away from. And what I mean here is that beauty in itself is meaningless because we have to instantiate it, we have to particularize it. We can think, for example, of a beautiful human being, good looking, but that does not exhaust the ideal of beauty. We can think of a beautiful landscape, but that does not exhaust the idea of beauty. We can think of a beautiful poem, but that does not exhaust the idea of beauty, and so on. We can arrive at the concept of beauty, the ideal of beauty, by identifying attributes in particulars. And by identifying this common in the multitude, we give it a name and we say, okay, that which we find as common in this multitude, we give it a name and we call it beauty. But beauty as such cannot be named. Beauty as such cannot be described. What is beauty as such? As such, we need to return to the specifics. We can understand the ideals, but we cannot remain at the level of the ideals. Our life, our existence is a practical existence. It is an existence that unfolds in a world of details, in a world of particularities. It is not a theoretical presence. It is not something that can be limited to analytical extremes, to ideals. So when we are talking about avoiding the extremes, we have to consider what I talked about in the previous episode. We have to consider that moderation cannot be understood in abstract. The idea of moderation, the ideal of it, can be understood in abstract. But when we want to apply it, we have to think of the particulars. So we have to couch it in terms of something that can be particularized. And in this case, that something would be a human being, an individual person. And we would say, know yourself in order to figure out what your extremes are. Know yourself and learn about those extremes in order to figure out what your middle way is. Learn about the world in order to know who you are, and then figure out what the middle way is, and so on. What I explained at length in chapter 2. The reason I talked about all those themes is exactly because it is very easy to use those binaries, those pairs, and arrive at simplistic conclusions of a one-size-fits-all. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all in life. We have to be able to particularize. We have to be able to individuate, because the world is a world of particularities. It is a world of individuation. It is a world of incessant differentiation. A world of cosmic transfiguration, as I also said in chapter 1. Now, what do I mean by this particularization of the concept of moderation? Let's see it here in practice. We have this idea of weakening the ambitions of people. What is the right level of ambition? Is ambition something that is general, that applies to all facets of our life? Or can we as individuals have different levels of ambition for different levels of things? For example, my ambition when doing these videos is excellence, is to do it as best as I can. My ambition to be, I don't know, a money maker is very, very low. My ambition to be a politician is 0, and so on. So what is the right level of ambition here? For an individual person, already we can see that we have to particularize it for each compartment, as it were, for each facet of our life. So there is no uniform ambition that applies to our life, just to an individual. Now extend this to every other person and tell me what the right level of ambition is. Let's talk about interpersonal affairs. Let's limit it to one specific example. Let's say football, a sport. So we have arguably the greatest footballer of all time, Lionel Messi, who has a level of ambition that is the level of the best of the best. And on the other hand, we have an amateur footballer whose level of ambition is to kick the ball straight, to be able to kick it well, but otherwise cannot even imagine what Messi is capable of. What is the right level of ambition between those two with regard to the act of playing football? If we try to come up with an average, let's say some middle of the road between Messi and this amateur, we will have something that is too low for Messi and too high for the amateur footballer. It is something that does not work for either of them. The one-size-fits-all is not a workable solution. It is a bad solution. It is a solution that will not only not have the desired effect, but will actually cause more trouble, more tensions, a greater sense of injustice. Because you will have someone as capable as Messi feel unjustly treated for being held back by others who don't have that ability. Furthermore, a sage is not omniscient. A sage does not have knowledge of all the particulars. What does a sage know about football, for example? if they have never played football? And the answer is very little or nothing at all. Maybe they know a few things about character building, about the importance of discipline, that you should train hard and so on. But when it comes to the practicality of it, when it comes to the specifics, the answer is that the sage is not the right person to talk to. What does a sage know about the mechanics of constructing a bridge, for example? If they are not an expert engineer or architect, or I don't know what the field of expertise for building bridges is. And the answer again is that the sage is not the right person to ask. What does a sage know about how to deal with a pandemic? What does a sage know about climate change? What does a sage know about making the internet infrastructure work? What does the sage know about network neutrality? What does the sage know about anything that is specific? It is important not to exalt humans. Sages are still human. Sages are not omniscient. Sages still make mistakes. Sages still lack insight. To trust the governance of all the specifics to people who lack insight, even if those people are sages, even if they are saints, is to commit a mistake. The mistake of putting the wrong people in charge of the wrong things. When we have a top-down approach, as the one implicit here, we have a few people decide on behalf of the many. We also have a few people decide over many things, not just many people, but many topics, many areas of policy making. And without the kind of involvement and deliberation that factors in all points of view, all fields of expertise, you cannot have good governance. A problem of our era now is not a problem of not having sages in charge of things. It is a problem of not having enough involvement, of not having deliberation at the level of decision making. We have a top-down approach where politicians pretend to know more than they actually do, even if they have good intentions. And the result is always suboptimal. It is always a bad result. And the same would be true if we had sages in charge deciding. The philosopher kings, as Platon imagined. If only we could have the kings be philosophers. How great would that be? Because then, Platon thinks, we would have wisdom inform all decisions. And we would have a harmonious society in the same way that Lao Zi implies here. Would we though? Would a philosopher be a good king? Make for a good king? Maybe it seems to us that the philosopher would be a better king than some corrupt moron. Perhaps that makes sense. But this does not say anything about the philosopher's ability to govern. It does not say anything about their insight into the specifics. It does not say anything about their willingness to do what must be done when it comes to gray areas that cannot be understood in terms of analytics. We live in vivo. Our life is a life of the specifics. It's not a life of abstractions. But when we philosophize, we are to an extent thinking of the world in vitro. we are abstracting away from the specifics. When we come up with ethical views, for example, when we come up with some notion of justice, we are thinking in abstract terms. But if you have ever paid attention to how judges adjudicate, if you have ever noticed how complex this process is and how detail-oriented it is, you will understand that even if we have a very good theory of jurisprudence, the philosophy of law, a theory of ethics, even then, we still have to treat things on a case-by-case basis. And we still have to come up with exceptions. And we still have to arrive at some truth that is pertinent to a given interpretation of the facts of the case, the specifics of the case. My point is that the top-down approach of governance is not feasible. It is not feasible because it assumes away the particularities. It gives too much power to a few people, and it thinks that those few people have the capacity, have the insight to deal over, to preside over the complexity of our collective affairs. I think this is not possible, whether we are talking about crooks who are dictators, or whether we are talking about sages who are well-meaning. We will still not have a good system, because the system is inherently biased in ways that are against the specifics. We have a mismatch between localized information and what the bureaucrats or the governance or the elite will have access to. And without the knowledge of the particulars, the information on the particulars, those who are governing will make mistakes. And this is something, of course, that we can understand very well when we study economics. When we study economics, we are studying exactly this point, the particularities of information, and how markets are able to internalize information and disseminate information in ways that we could not do through a central planning system, especially at scale, at a very large scale. This is not to say that the markets we have nowadays are free markets in the way you will read in the economics textbooks. Quite the contrary. Free markets have never existed in the history of capitalism. Capitalism is intervention by the state in favor of the capital owners. Intervention by the state in the formation of capital owners, in the formation of people, or persons rather, legal or physical, who control platforms. Platforms upon which economic behavior unfolds. I call those platform arcs. And the history of capitalism is the history of intervention in favor of the platform arcs. But conceptually, free markets can internalize and disseminate information that no mind, no individual person or small group can manage and control centrally. And this is again to the point of governance, about strengthening people's bodies, filling their stomachs, weakening their ambitions. We have to be able to particularize all those. And we have to then think about the sufficiency of all this. Is it enough to have a basic sense of safety, to have food, to have shelter, to be healthy? Those are, of course, very valuable to everyone. Everyone wants those. But is this enough? Would you be satisfied if you had food, shelter, and health, but nothing else? If you had no art in your life, would you be happy? If you had no sport in your life, would you be happy? If you had no sense of excitement by doing science or by programming something that makes your life easier with the computer, or whatever else it is that we are doing, would you be happy? The reason I am asking this is because I want to get back to the point of particularizing those insights for the individual person. Because even if you make provisions as a central authority for what constitutes culture, what constitutes art, what constitutes sport, and so on, you will still be behaving in a way that is biased in some way, because you will still be working towards a certain midpoint that is not the midpoint of every single person. There is no one size fits all. And this is also a discussion we see in our modern era, where we have the identity of an individual, how the person identifies as their gender, as their sex, as their religiosity, and so on, as their hobbies, as their interests. We see incredible diversity among people. Diversity which cannot be reduced to a simple binary. And in that binary, there exists some middle of the road, and we can have that as an average that works for everyone. The average, not only it is bad, it is counterproductive, as I already said. It will cause more trouble. Still, what Lao Zi is saying here is not wrong. There is truth to it. There is truth to the notion that governance by sages can be fruitful, because there are many things here that make perfect sense, like to simplify the people's minds, fill their stomachs, weaken their ambitions, and strengthen their bodies. To simplify their minds, however, is not something that can be done through governance. It is something that must be done through education. Education, then, is about teaching. It is about saying things. It is about acting. We want to trust in the process, as I also commented in the previous episode. We want to trust in the process, but we cannot afford, as humans, we cannot afford to live in inaction. Our life is a life of action, whether we like it or not. We have to do stuff. We have to eat, for example. That already is one action. We have to breathe. That is an action. We have to make decisions under imperfect circumstances, in imperfect circumstances, with imperfect, incomplete information. At any moment, we have to perform a leap of faith into the unknown, because we don't have perfect insight. The fact that we are not omniscient means that we are always acting in faith. Even when we are striving to have the most objective of methods, where there still is implicit in that the notion that what we are doing is correct, that our instruments are the right instruments, that our intellectual faculty is the right faculty, and so on. We are not omniscient, and this means that we cannot have the perfect before we go about doing things. We have to work with what we get. We have to accept what is available and operate within those constraints. This is why, in abstract, let's return to chapter 2. In abstract, what is said here in the third paragraph of chapter 2, in abstract, this is correct. I am reading, therefore, sages manage affairs without contrived actions, teach without speech, allow all things to develop without forcing them to start, promote things without requiring gratitude, and accomplish things without claiming the credits. What we can understand here, when we couch it in terms of politics, in terms of social affairs, is that you need to have a degree of laissez-faire, a degree of letting things run their course, of not trying to micromanage everything and allow people to express their individuality. However, we are still talking about a degree. We still have to figure out what the degree is, what the specifics are. We cannot afford no action when it comes to all the specifics. When it comes to a person's individual life, then yes, this makes sense, because then yes, you will refrain from acting in a way that is clearly biased. You will, as the expression goes, err on the side of caution. And you will allow things to run their course and see what happens. And discover the truth in the process. The approximation of the truth in the process. Because you will still not have the truth as such. You will still be in a relative state of ignorance. But when it comes to social affairs, when it comes to governance, we are already talking about governance. We are already talking about action. Governance is action, to govern, to decide, to manage. These are all actions. These are actions that must have some purpose. They must be governed, they must be underpinned by some kind of insight, some sort of information. They must be contributing towards something. They cannot be disconcerted. Can we have governance by sages? It makes sense. It makes sense to have wise people in charge. But the more we think about it, the more difficult this is to apply. What we can have, I think, is institutions that are underpinned by insights which are wise, but otherwise our affairs are still managed with the recognition that our world is not a world of ideals. It is not a world of good versus evil. It is a world of all the grays in between black and white. It is a world of indeterminate affairs. It is a world where we cannot clearly demarcate one from the other. We cannot draw indelible lines in our everyday affairs. There are some clear-cut cases, but generally, things are very tricky. So we want to avoid the extreme of thinking that ideals can be managed as such without reference to the specifics. And find the middle way therein, which is that humans are imperfect, the world is complex, and politics will always be messy. Messy with a Y, not Messi the football. There is a final point here, which has to do with the disposition of a sage. Politics is messy. Politics is very difficult, very dirty. And you are asking a sage to leave behind this otherwise privileged lifestyle of dealing with abstractions, of figuring out the linkages between concepts and so on. And you are asking this sage to come and now manage people with different levels of ambition, with different needs, with different agendas. You want the sage to be the peacekeeper. You want the sage to be the tutelary figure. You want the sage to be all those roles that are necessary to govern. But do you think the sage has that kind of character? Do you think the kind of person who withdraws from society to think about all those concepts, to think about the Tao, do you think that this is the person that you can put in the parliament and have them fight every other member of parliament? Do you think that this is a person that can be king and now have to micromanage all the feudal lords and their petty interests, their parochial interests? Do you think this is the kind of person that has that character? Because I think not. I think a sage will not survive for one day in that role. Let alone forever, let alone to have governance by sages. My point is that it makes sense to have harmony in our life. It makes sense to think of this. But we have to consider how we go about teaching people about those virtues. If we want to do it at the level of politics, we have to understand that there are different requirements. Different requirements at the level of politics than at the level of the individual. Different requirements at the level of specificity in general. There is, to everything we consider, a scope of application, as I call it. You have to be able to understand the concepts in terms of the particularities. And if you don't consider the scope of application, you are simply talking nonsense. We can have harmonious societies, but we need to have institutions that are underpinned by wise insights. And then acknowledge that we will have imperfect management of affairs. And we will always try for the best, but it doesn't mean that we will have it. And we will always try to be inclusive, to be deliberative, because therein lies the greatest of virtues, which is to remain dialectical, which is to consider different points of view. And how do we do that at the social level if we have a top-down system? We cannot do that. To have deliberation, to have dialecticism at the social level, we have to have a bottom-up approach. We have to have a participatory approach. This, of course, is another discussion. I won't go into that. I will let you think about it. I will let you think whether we can have enlightened despots, sages who can be in charge of things and everybody else will follow their directives. I think this is not feasible, and if it is feasible, it is not desirable. Maybe you have a different point of view, in which case I am interested to see how you would go about particularizing such a system. And whether you think if such a system would be just for everyone, or whether your sense of justice is just an average, and if the average can indeed be understood as justice. Let's think about it. So I will close with this, and I will continue next time on chapter 4 and maybe chapter 5, because they are small, so maybe I will do them together. I will see. In conclusion, again, what I said in the introduction, my approach when I am reading this book is to not be reverential, is to not pretend that this is the single source of truth, is to not try to find some hidden meaning, some hidden truth in individual words. I am using this as the impetus of my commentary. I am using this to say things that I would have said anyway. But I am doing it in a way that is a synthesis, in a way that introduces you to the concepts of Tao Te Ching and to commentary that is not in Tao Te Ching, but perhaps relevant to what you learn from Lao Zi. That's all for today, folks. Thank you very much for your attention. Take care, goodbye, and I will see you next time.